Hello, and welcome to M and Mike Read a Book. I'm Mike.
I'm M.
And we're reading The Count of Monte Cristo. And we're about to read chapter 15. We hope you're doing well. I'm trying to remember what chapter 14 was about. I think we were going through with the prisoners.
Chapter 14 was like the inspector and
The governor.
He's like, what do you want, Dantes? And Dantes is like, I want a fair trial. And if I can't get a fair trial, I just want to know why I'm in here and all that stuff.
Yeah, like, it was like...
Very reasonable.
He was trying to state the case to, like, you know, if you just look at my case, they'll let me out. And he, like...
Yeah.
Presented it, and he has this hope, this faith that maybe the system will work.
Yeah, and then
it's not gonna work.
He's like, the guy was like, oh, who was your jailer? And then he's like, oh, it was Villefort. Oh, can he be trusted? Oh my god, yeah.
Yeah, totally. Just check with this Villefort guy. I totally vouch for him.
So sad.
Unbelievable.
Just the worst.
All right, so moving on then to chapter 15. Chapter 15, number 34 and number 27. I believe that's referring to prisoner numbers. 34 is Dantes, and we believe 27 is the Abbé.
The Abbé. Yeah. Gonna be so good. They're gonna bust out.
Yeah.
Get the treasure.
Or plan to bust out. We'll see. Let's do this. So why don't you start us off?
Okay. Chapter 15, number 34 and number 27. Dantes passed through all the stages of torture natural to prisoners in suspense. He was sustained at first by that pride of conscious innocence, which is the sequence to hope. Then he began to doubt his own innocence, which justified in some measure the governor's belief in his mental alienation. And then, relaxing his sentiment of pride, he addressed his supplications, not to God, but to man. God is always the last resource. Unfortunates, who ought to begin with God, do not have any hope in him till they have exhausted all other means of deliverance. Dantes asked to be removed from his present dungeon into another, even if it were darker and deeper, for a change, however disadvantageous. Am I saying that right?
For a change, however disadvantageous. Yeah, I think so.
Right. For a change, however disadvantageous, was still a change, and would afford him some amusement. He entreated to be allowed to walk about, to have fresh air, books, and writing materials. His requests were not granted, but he went on asking all the same. He accustomed himself to speaking to the new jailer, although the latter was, if possible, more taciturn than the old one. But still, to speak to a man, even though mute, was something. Dantes spoke for the sake of hearing his own voice. He had tried to speak when alone, but the sound of his own voice terrified him. I tell you.
Okay. Often before his captivity, Dantes's mind had revolted at the idea of assemblages of prisoners made up of thieves, vagabonds, and murderers. He now wished to be amongst them, in order to see some other face besides that of his jailer. He sighed for the galleys, with the infamous costume, the chain, and the brand on the shoulder. The galley slaves breathed the fresh air of heaven and saw each other. They were very happy. Clearly he's delusional. That's crazy. But, I mean, obviously as people who have been in physical distancing and in social isolation, I guess I can kind of understand a little bit that he's like, I just want to see someone else.
Anybody.
It's
like he's been in solitary.
A little bit, yeah. He's
right?
got a jailer who won't even talk to him.
Mm-hmm.
So that actually kind of answers a question that I think you asked at the end of the last episode, which was, do you think that Dantes can speak to the Abbé? And I guess not. I don't think so. It doesn't sound like it. He besought the jailer one day to let him have a companion, were it even the mad Abbé. The jailer, though rough and hardened by the constant sight of so much suffering, was yet a man. At the bottom of his heart, he had often had a feeling of pity for this unhappy young man who suffered so, and he laid the request of number 34 before the governor, but the latter sapiently imagined that Dantes wished to conspire or attempt an escape, and refused his request.
Man.
Dantes had exhausted all human resources, and he then turned to God. He had talked to HR, got nowhere, and was now turning to God.
HR's above God.
just below. I'll do one more paragraph and then you take it.
Okay.
All the pious ideas that had been so long forgotten returned. He recollected the prayers his mother had taught him, and discovered a new meaning in every word. For in prosperity, prayers seem but a mere medley of words, until misfortune comes and the unhappy sufferer first understands the meaning of the sublime language in which he invokes the pity of heaven. He prayed, and prayed aloud, no longer terrified at the sound of his own voice, for he fell into a sort of ecstasy. He laid every action of his life before the Almighty, proposed tasks to accomplish, and at the end of every prayer, introduced the entreaty oftener addressed to man than to God. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive them that trespass against us. Yet in spite of his earnest prayers, Dantes remained a prisoner. He proposed tasks to accomplish. That's a little bit of
He gave God a to-do
hubris.
list.
Yeah, like, hey God, while you're here, room could use a little dusting. Here's a little chore
Use
list.
a window.
Yeah. All right, why don't you take it?
All right. Then gloom settled heavily upon him. Dantes was a man of great simplicity of thought. Wait, really? Okay. I always thought he was very thoughtful. Okay. He was a man of great simplicity of thought and without education. He could not, therefore, in the solitude of his dungeon, traverse in mental vision the history of the ages, bring to life the nations that had perished, and rebuild the ancient cities so vast and stupendous in the light of the imagination, and that passed before the eye, glowing with celestial colors in Martin's Babylonian pictures.
So I don't think they're saying he's not smart. It's just
like,
that he hasn't read much.
Right.
Like he hasn't been. He's not got like a full library.
And he doesn't have a very good imagination, I guess.
Imagination, education, yeah.
He could not do this. He whose past life was so short, whose present so melancholy, and his future so doubtful. 19 years of light to reflect upon in eternal darkness. No distraction could come to his aid. His energetic spirit, that would have exalted in thus revisiting the past, was imprisoned like an eagle in a cage. He clung to one idea, that of his happiness, destroyed, without apparent cause, by an unheard of fatality. He considered and reconsidered this idea, devoured it, so to speak, as the implacable Ugolino devours the skull of Archbishop Roger in the Inferno of Dante.
Yeah, it's been a long time since I read that in school. I don't know who Ugolino is.
Ugo.
Skull of
Ugo. Maybe he's an Ugo.
Okay. Ugo. He's an Ugo. The very first prototypical Ugo was Ugolino. Very good.
Rage supplanted religious fervor. Dantes uttered blasphemies that made his jailer recoil with horror.
Just dropping the F-bomb just through the bars. Hey, boop.
Dashed himself furiously against the walls of his prison, wreaked his anger upon everything, and chiefly upon himself, so that the least thing, a grain of sand, a straw, or a breath of air that annoyed him, led to paroxysms of fury. Then the letter that Villefort had showed to him recurred to his mind, and every line gleamed forth in fiery letters on the wall like the Mene, Tekel Parson of Belshazzar.
I don't get that reference.
Yeah.
I don't get it.
Yeah. He told himself that it was the enmity of man and not the vengeance of heaven that had thus plunged him into the deepest misery. He consigned his unknown persecutors to the most horrible tortures he could imagine, and found them all insufficient, because after torture came death, and after death, if not repose, at least the boon of unconsciousness.
To die, to sleep. There's the rub. Okay. By dint of constantly dwelling on the idea that tranquility was death, and if punishment were the end in view, other torture. Wait, what? By dint of constantly dwelling on the idea that tranquility was death, and if punishment were the end in view, other tortures than death must be invented. Were the end in view. What?
I know.
Please help me parse this. By dint of constantly dwelling on the idea that tranquility was death, okay, there's an idea, and if punishment were the end in view,
other tortures than death must be invented.
Were the end in view, other tortures than death must be invented. He began to reflect on suicide. That's kind of ironically, a torturous sentence. Okay. Unhappy he who, on the brink of misfortune, broods over ideas like these. Before him is a dead sea that stretches in azure calm before the eye. But he who unwarily ventures within its embrace finds himself struggling with a monster that would drag him down to perdition. Once thus ensnared, unless the protecting hand of God snatch him thence, all is over, and his struggles but tend to hasten his destruction. This state of mental anguish is, however, less terrible than the sufferings that precede or the punishment that possibly will follow. There is a sort of consolation at the contemplation of the yawning abyss, at the bottom of which lie darkness and obscurity. Wow. There's a lot of like I'm hearing the author more than any of the characters right now. He's kind of like reflecting on suffering and torture and like reaching the point where you're like, just death take me. Okay, I'll do this last paragraph and then why don't you take over? Edmund found some solace in his ideas. All his sorrows, all his sufferings, with their train of gloomy specters, fled from his cell when the angel of death seemed about to enter. Dantes reviewed his past life with composure, and, looking forward with terror to his future existence, chose that middle line that seemed to afford him a refuge.
"Sometimes," said he, "in my voyages, when I was a man and commanded other men, I have seen the heavens overcast, the sea rage and foam, the storm arise, and, like a monstrous bird, beating the two horizons with its wings. Then I felt that my vessel was a vain refuge, that trembled and shook before the tempest. Soon the fury of the waves and the sight of the sharp rocks announced the approach of death, and death then terrified me, and I used all my skill and intelligence as a man and a sailor to struggle against the wrath of God. But I did so because I was happy, because I had not courted death, because to be cast upon a bed of rocks and seaweed seemed terrible, because I was unwilling that I, a creature made for the service of God, should serve for food to the gulls and ravens. But now it is different. I have lost all that bound me to life. Death smiles and invites me to repose. I die after my own manner. I die exhausted and broken-spirited. As I fall asleep, when I have paced 3,000 times round my cell, that is 30,000 steps, or about 10 leagues." So he's like, kind of his perspective on death has
changed. Yeah, like you'd almost welcome it like a friend now. It's death smiles and invites me to repose.
Right.
Yeah.
No sooner had this idea taken possession of him than he became more composed, arranged his couch. He has a couch? Okay.
What? He arranged his couch, moved it back from the TV. You know, he had his like his bicycle, his like stationary bike. Yeah.
His Peloton. Arranged his couch to the best of his power, ate little and slept less, and found existence almost supportable because he felt that he could throw it off at pleasure like a worn-out garment. Two methods of self-destruction were at his disposal. He could hang himself with his handkerchief to the window bars, or refuse food and die of starvation.
Dark.
But the first was repugnant to him. Dantes had always entertained the greatest horror of pirates, who are hung up to the yardarm. He would not die by what seemed an infamous death. He resolved to adopt the second, and began that day to carry out his resolve. Oh, this is
So
the
he's just
worst.
gonna full-blown
Starving to death is the worst.
hunger strike time. Is this? I guess he's pouring his food out. Though
Maybe.
it's wild. Like I guess they would punish him if he wasn't eating. They'd force feed him or something. But if
Maybe.
they think he's eating, then they'll be like, "Oh, I guess he was just sick. Must have had a tapeworm."
I hate
All right. Here we go. Nearly 4 years had passed away. At the end of the second, he had ceased to mark the lapse of time. Dantes said, "I wish to die," and had chosen the manner of his death, and fearful of changing his mind, he had taken an oath to die. "When my morning and evening meals are brought," thought he, "I will cast them out of the window, and they will think that I have eaten them." Eventually, someone's going to find a pile of food. They're going to see, like, there's a bunch of rats or birds. Like, hey, what's going on over there? Oh, wow, look at all that food. Okay. He kept his word. Twice a day he cast out, through the barred aperture, the provisions his jailer brought him. At first gaily, then with deliberation, and, at last, with regret. Nothing but the recollection of his oath gave him strength to proceed. Hunger made viands once repugnant, now acceptable. He held the plate in his hand for an hour at a time and gazed thoughtfully at the morsel of bad meat, of tainted fish, of black and moldy bread. It was the last yearning for life contending with the resolution of despair. Then his dungeon seemed less somber, his prospects less desperate. That's so interesting. It's like the one thing he has control over. Like, that's what is giving him sort of comfort here, is I have at least control over this.
Yeah.
He was still young. He was only 4 or 5 and 20. Okay, 25 or 24. Okay. He had nearly 50 years to live. Yeah, that's right. I mean, life expectancy. And that's so good. What unforeseen events might not open his prison door and restore him to liberty? Then he raised to his lips the repast that, like a voluntary Tantalus, he refused himself, but he thought of his oath, and he would not break it. He persisted until, at last, he had not sufficient strength to rise and cast his supper out of the loophole. The next morning he could not see or hear. The jailer feared he was dangerously ill. Edmund hoped he was dying. Why don't you take over?
Thus the day passed away. Edmund felt a sort of stupor creeping over him, which brought with it a feeling almost of content. The gnawing pain at his stomach had ceased, his thirst had abated, and when he closed his eyes he saw myriads of lights dancing before them like the will-o'-the-wisps that play about the marshes. It was the twilight of that mysterious country called death. Suddenly, about 9 o'clock in the evening, Edmund heard a hollow sound in the wall against which he was lying. So many loathsome animals inhabited the prison that their noise did not in general awake him, but whether abstinence had quickened his faculties, or whether the noise was really louder than usual, Edmund raised his head and listened. It was a continual scratching, as if made by a huge claw, a powerful tooth, or some iron instrument attacking the stones. Abbe!
Or rodents in the walls.
Oh. Although weakened, the young man's brain instantly responded to the idea that haunts all prisoners.
Oh, someone's digging.
Liberty.
Yeah.
It seemed to him that heaven had at length taken pity on him, and had sent this noise to warn him on the very brink of the abyss. Perhaps one of those beloved ones he had so often thought of was thinking of him, and striving to diminish the distance that separated them. No, doubtless he was deceived, and it was but one of those dreams that forerun death. Edmund still heard the sound. It lasted nearly 3 hours. He then heard a sound of something falling, and all was silent. For some hours afterwards it began again, nearer and more distinct. Edmund was intensely interested. Suddenly, the jailer entered. Take it away.
For a week since he had resolved to die, and during the 4 days that he had been carrying out his purpose, Edmund had not spoken to the attendant, had not answered him when he inquired what was the matter with him, and turned his face to the wall when he looked too curiously at him. But now the jailer might hear the noise and put an end to it, and so destroy a ray of something like hope that soothed his last moments. The jailer brought him his breakfast. Dantes raised himself up and began to talk about everything, about the bad quality of the food, about the coldness of his dungeon, grumbling and complaining, in order to have an excuse for speaking louder and wearying the patience of his jailer, who, out of kindness of heart, had brought broth and white bread for his prisoner. Fortunately, he fancied that Dantes was delirious, and may have been, and placing the food on the rickety table, he withdrew. Edmund listened, and the sound became more and more distinct. "There can be no doubt about it," thought he. "It is some prisoner who is striving to obtain his freedom. Oh, if I were only there to help him." Suddenly, another idea took possession of his mind, so used to misfortune that it was scarcely capable of hope, the idea that the noise was made by workmen the governor had ordered to repair the neighboring dungeon.
Noise was made
What?
by workmen the government had ordered to repair.
That's not what I would have thought. That's not like the first... Wait a second, maybe someone's repairing the dungeon next door. I would be like, it's rats or something. But I don't know. I don't know dungeons. It was easy to ascertain this, but how could he risk the question? It was easy to call his jailer's attention to the noise and watch his countenance as he listened, but might he not by this means destroy hopes far more important than the short-lived satisfaction of his own curiosity? Unfortunately, Edmund's brain was still so feeble that he could not bend his thoughts to anything in particular. He saw but one means of restoring lucidity and clearness to his judgment. He turned his eyes towards the soup which the jailer had brought, rose, staggered towards it, raised the vessel to his lips, and drank of the contents with a feeling of indescribable pleasure. Okay. Well, that's good. Why don't you take over?
He had the resolution to stop with this. He had often heard that shipwrecked persons had died through having eagerly devoured too much food. Edmund replaced on the table the bread he was about to devour and returned to his couch. He did not wish to die. He soon felt that his ideas became again collected. He could think and strengthen his thoughts by reasoning. Can he hide bread on himself? Like, can he store food for later?
I don't know where.
Yeah,
like,
true.
Armpit?
He's got kind of a robe, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Armpit. For seasoning. Then he said to himself, I must put this to the test, but without compromising anybody. If it is a workman, I need but knock against the wall, and he will cease to work in order to find out who is knocking.
Hey! It's like a neighbor.
Yeah.
Like, hey, I'm trying to sleep.
To find out who is knocking and why he does so. But as his occupation is sanctioned by the governor, he will soon resume it. If, on the contrary, it is a prisoner, the noise I make will alarm him, he will cease and not begin again until he thinks everyone is asleep. Edmund rose again, but this time his legs did not tremble, and his sight was clear. He went to a corner of his dungeon, detached a stone, and with it knocked against the wall where the sound came. He struck thrice. At the first blow, the sound ceased as if by magic. Edmund listened intently. An hour passed, 2 hours passed, and no sound was heard from the wall. All was silent there. Full of hope, Edmund swallowed a few mouthfuls of bread and water, and thanks to the vigor of his constitution, found himself well nigh recovered. The day passed in utter silence. Night came without recurrence of the noise. "It is a prisoner," said Edmund joyfully. His brain was on fire, and life and energy returned. The night passed in perfect silence. Edmund did not close his eyes. In the morning, the jailer brought him fresh provisions. He had already devoured those of the previous day. He ate these, listening anxiously for the sound, walking round and round his cell, shaking the iron bars of the loophole, restoring vigor and agility to his limbs by exercise, and so preparing himself for his future destiny. All right. At intervals, he listened to learn if the noise had not begun again, and grew impatient at the prudence of the prisoner, who did not guess he had been disturbed by a captive as anxious for liberty as himself. 3 days passed, 72 long, tedious hours which he counted off by minutes. At length one evening, as the jailer was visiting him for the last time that night, Dantes, with his ear for the 100th time at the wall, fancied he heard an almost imperceptible movement among the stones. He moved away, walked up and down his cell to collect his thoughts, and then went back and listened.
The matter was no longer doubtful. Something was at work on the other side of the wall. The prisoner had discovered the danger and had substituted a lever for a chisel. Encouraged by this discovery, Edmund determined to assist the I've never known how to say this word out loud. Indefatigable laborer. He began by moving his bed, and looked around for anything with which he could pierce the wall, penetrate the moist cement, and displace a stone. He saw nothing. He had no knife or sharp instrument. The window grating was of iron, but he had too often assured himself of its solidity. All his furniture consisted of a bed, a chair, a table, a pail, and a jug. The bed had iron clamps, but they were screwed to the wood, and it would have required a screwdriver to take them off. The table and chair had nothing. The pail had once possessed a handle, but that had been removed. Well, is this the jailer? Is that who we're looking at here?
I don't know. I think it's the Abbé sitting down, don't you think? Or is that... I think it's the Abbé sitting down.
That can't be Dantes, because Dantes is pretty messed up too. He's got a beard and stuff.
I have no idea.
Okay. It doesn't have a label on it. All right, too bad. Dantes had but one resource, which was to break the jug, and with one of the sharp fragments attack the wall. He let the jug fall on the floor, and it broke in pieces. Dantes concealed 2 or 3 of the sharpest fragments in his bed, leaving the rest on the floor. The breaking of his jug was too natural an accident to excite suspicion. Edmund had all the night to work in, but in the darkness he could not do much, and he soon felt that he was working against something very hard. He pushed back his bed and waited for day. All night he heard the subterranean workman, who continued to mine his way. Day came. The jailer entered. Dantes told him that the jug had fallen from his hands while he was drinking, and the jailer went grumblingly to fetch another, without giving himself the trouble to remove the fragments of the broken one. He returned speedily, advising the prisoner to be more careful, and departed.
Dantes heard joyfully the key grate in the lock. He listened until the sound of steps died away, and then, hastily displacing his bed, saw by the faint light that penetrated into his cell that he had labored uselessly the previous evening in attacking the stone instead of removing the plaster that surrounded it. Is plaster around the stone?
Yeah, so I would imagine that this wall is formed by piling stones and like holding it in place with plaster.
Got it, right.
And so the soft stuff is the plaster.
Surely,
You fool!
Surely he could have felt that. All right. The damp had rendered it friable, and Dantes was able to break it off. In small morsels, it is true, but at the end of half an hour he had scraped off a handful. A mathematician might have calculated that in 2 years, supposing that the rock was not encountered, a passage 20 feet long and 2 feet broad might be formed. The prisoner reproached himself with not having thus employed the hours he had passed in vain hopes, prayers, and despondency. During the 6 years that he had been imprisoned, what might he not have accomplished?
Oh,
I
that's
thought it was
brutal.
4 years.
I also thought 4 years.
Okay, all right. Well, damn. Yeah, that's pretty brutal.
Maybe it's 4 years since he talked to the governor.
Oh.
And like stated his case.
Okay.
But 6 years total.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, tell you.
That's brutal though, because if you're like 6 years in and you're like, oh, I could have been digging this whole time. What's
How
wrong?
did you not realize that you could have been digging though? Like, come on, Dantes.
He went straight for suicide. He went straight for it. This idea imparted new energy, and in 3 days he had succeeded with the utmost precaution in removing the cement and exposing the stonework. The wall was built of rough stones, among which, to give strength to the structure, blocks of hewn stone were at intervals embedded. It was one of these he had uncovered, and which he must remove from its socket. Dantes strove to do this with his nails, but they were too weak. The fragments of the jug broke, and after an hour of useless toil, Dantes paused with anguish on his brow. Was he to be thus stopped at the beginning, and was he to wait inactive until his fellow workman had completed his task? Suddenly, an idea occurred to him. He smiled, and the perspiration dried on his forehead. The jailer always brought Dantes's soup in an iron saucepan. The saucepan contained soup for both prisoners, for Dantes had noticed that it was either quite full or half empty, according as the turnkey gave it to him or his companion first. The handle of this saucepan was of iron. Dantes would have given 10 years of his life in exchange for it.
And there he is.
There he is, broke his jug.
Right, he's kind of got, like, a muscle butt now.
Yeah, he's been exercising. All right, why don't you take over?
The jailer was accustomed to pour the contents of the saucepan into Dantes's plate, and Dantes, after eating his soup with a wooden spoon, washed the plate which thus served for every day. Now, when evening came, Dantes put his plate on the ground near the door. The jailer, as he entered, stepped on it and broke it.
Oh!
This time he could not blame Dantes. He was wrong to leave it there, but the jailer was wrong not to have looked before him. The jailer, therefore, only grumbled. Then he looked about for something to pour the soup into. Dantes's entire dinner service consisted of one plate. There was no alternative. "Leave the saucepan," said Dantes. "You can take it away when you bring me my breakfast."
Clever boy.
This advice was to the jailer's taste, as it spared him the necessity of making another trip. He left the saucepan.
Nice.
Dantes was beside himself with joy. He rapidly devoured his food, and after waiting an hour, lest the jailer should change his mind and return, he removed his bed, took the handle of the saucepan, inserted the point between the hewn stone and rough stones of the wall, and employed it as a lever. A slight oscillation showed Dantes that all went well. At the end of an hour, the stone was extricated from the wall, leaving a cavity 1.5 feet in diameter. What if he's going, like... How does he know what direction to go in?
There are a lot of problems here. I mean, it's great that he can dig, but there's some obvious problems. It's like,
he could dig into the office of some
yeah,
dude.
which way are you pointed? I mean, he knows which way is outside. There's a window, so he knows that
True.
at least that direction takes you
But
outside.
should he dig towards his buddy?
That's another good question. And the other thing is, what do you do with all the waste material? That was always the problem in both.
Throw it out the window. Oh.
Well, maybe. That's actually not a bad
Chip
idea.
it into little tiny rocks.
And then where do you put it? Like, you've got like a handful of this grit. You gotta somehow get rid of it. Throw it through the window? Maybe. That's probably your best bet, is actually through the window. Unless you eat it, which not gonna happen. But that was always the issue with like the Shawshank Redemption.
What did they do?
And the Great Escape. And then well, in those films, in those stories, the characters had time to go out in the yard, the work yard. And so they like built special mechanisms in their pants. They'd like have the dirt in their pants, they'd go out and they just like kind of kick it into the soil and mix it in. Righto.
Dantes carefully collected the plaster, carried it into the corner of his cell, and covered it with earth. Alright, you just bury it.
What?
Then, wishing to make the best use of his time while he had the means of labor, he continued to work without ceasing. At the dawn of day, he replaced the stone, pushed his bed against the wall, and lay down. The breakfast consisted of a piece of bread. The jailer entered and placed the bread on the table.
So if he starts like taking parts of his wall down and then burying the material that he's digging out over here, he's just moving his cell.
Yeah.
He's just moving it. Like,
true.
this hole is just moving.
Very true.
Yeah. Well, don't you intend to bring me another plate? Said Dantes. No, replied the turnkey. You destroy everything. First you break your jug, then you make me break your plate. If all the prisoners followed your example, the government would be ruined. I shall leave you the saucepan and pour your soup into that. So for the future, I hope you will not be so destructive. Dantes raised his eyes to heaven and clasped his hands beneath the coverlet. He felt more gratitude for the possession of this piece of iron than he had ever felt for anything. He had noticed, however, that the prisoner on the other side had ceased to labor. No matter, this was a greater reason for proceeding. If his neighbor would not come to him, he would go to his neighbor. All day he toiled on untiringly, and by the evening he had succeeded in extracting 10 handfuls of plaster and fragments of stone.
That's pretty good.
It's very good. When the hour of his jailer's visit arrived, Dantes straightened the handle of the saucepan as well as he could and placed it in its accustomed place. The turnkey poured his ration of soup into it, together with the fish, for thrice a week the prisoners were deprived of meat. This would have been a method of reckoning time, had not Dantes long ceased to do so. Having poured out the soup, the turnkey retired. This is good, like, from a sort of a mental health perspective, because now he's got a thing he can do. He's got a job he can do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, something to look forward to. I'll do this one more paragraph. Dantes wished to ascertain whether his neighbor had really ceased to work. He listened. All was silent, as it had been for the last 3 days. Dantes sighed. It was evident that his neighbor distrusted him. However, he toiled on all the night without being discouraged. But after 2 or 3 hours he encountered an obstacle. The iron made no impression, but met with a smooth surface. Dantes touched it and found that it was a beam. This beam crossed, or rather blocked up, the hole Dantes had made. It was necessary, therefore, to dig above or under it. The unhappy young man had not thought of this.
Oh my God, murmured he. I have so earnestly prayed to you that I hope my prayers had been heard. After having deprived me of my liberty, after having deprived me of death, after having recalled me to existence, my God, have pity on me and do not let me die in despair.
Okay, so this is an interesting visualization. It's like we have these giant blocks.
Yeah.
That are nice and snug together.
I would have thought they were like rough stones.
Yeah, I would have, in my mind they were like just stones from the beach or like big stones. But no, these look like cubes.
Crafted.
Yeah, and he's taken out the plaster and I guess he's yanked one of these things out.
Unless the illustrator just had a fun time and
just imagining.
Didn't actually talk to Dumas.
That's true. We don't actually know, but you know, this is something to feed the imagination.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
I can't remember what we gave the Abbé.
He's a little loopy.
Okay. Okay.
I gave him a lot of energy.
Okay. Who talks of good and despair at the same time? Said I don't know.
You give him a little bit of sass there. He's a little bit of a...
said a voice that seemed to come from beneath the earth and, deadened by the distance, sounded hollow and sepulchral in the young man's ears. Why haven't they talked in 6 years? Edmund's hair stood on end and he rose to his knees. Ah, said he. Is this Edmund? Okay. I hear a human voice. Edmund had not heard anyone speak save his jailer for 4 or 5 years, and a jailer is no man to a prisoner. He's a living door, a barrier of flesh and blood, adding strength to restraints of oak and iron. That's a great visual. In the name of heaven, cried Dantes, speak again, though the sound of your voice terrifies me. Who are you? Who are you? Said the voice. I don't know why. An unhappy prisoner, replied Dantes, who made no hesitation in answering. Of what country? A Frenchman? Your name? Edmond Dantes. Your profession? A sailor. How long have you been here? Since the 28th of February, 1815. Your crime? I am innocent. But of what are you accused? Of having conspired to aid the Emperor's return. What? For the Emperor's return? The Emperor is no longer on the throne, then? He abdicated at Fontainebleau in 1814. Sorry, that was not in French.
1814. Yeah.
And was sent to the island of Elba. But how long have you been here that you are ignorant of all this? Since 1811.
Dantes shuddered. This man had been 4 years longer than himself in prison. Do not dig any more, said the voice. Only tell me how high up is your excavation. On a level with the floor. How is it concealed? Behind my bed. Has your bed been moved since you have been a prisoner? No. What does your chamber open on? A corridor. And the corridor on a court. Alas, murmured the voice. Oh, what is the matter? Cried Dantes. I have made a mistake, owing to an error in my plans. For 5 years I've been thinking in the wrong direction. God. I took the wrong angle and have come out 15 feet from where I intended. I took the wall you are mining for the outer wall of the fortress. But then you would be close to the sea. That is what I had hoped. And supposing you had succeeded, I should have thrown myself into the sea, gained one of the islands near here, the Isle de Dôme or the Isle de Tiboulin, and then I should have been safe. Could you have swum so far? Heaven would have given me strength, but now all is lost. All? Yes. Stop up your excavation carefully. Do not work any more, and wait until you hear from me. Tell me, at least, who you are. I am number 27 or 27. Yeah. You mistrust me. Oh, you mistrust me then, said Dantes. Edmund fancied he heard a bitter laugh resounding from the depths. Oh, I am a Christian, cried Dantes, guessing instinctively that this man meant to abandon him. I swear to you by him who died for us that naught shall induce me to breathe one syllable to my jailers. But I conjure you, do not abandon me. If you do, I swear to you, for I have got to the end of my strength, that I will dash my brains out against the wall, and you will have my death to reproach yourself with. How old are you? Your voice is that of a young man.
You sound very dramatic.
This is very dramatic. You sound like you might be a petulant 15-year-old. I do not know my age, for I have not counted the years I have been here. All I do know is that I was just 19 when I was arrested the 28th of February, 1815. Not quite 26, murmured the voice. At that age, he cannot be a traitor. Take it from there.
Oh, no, no, cried Dantes. I swear to you again, rather than betray you, I would allow myself to be hacked in pieces. You have done well to speak to me and ask for my assistance, for I was about to form another plan and leave you. But your age reassures me. I will not forget you. Wait. How long? I must calculate our chances. I will give you the signal. But you will not leave me. You will come to me, or you will let me come to you. We will escape, and if we cannot escape, we will talk. You of those whom you love, and I of those whom I love. You must love somebody. No, I am alone in the world.
Damn it.
Then you will love me. If you are young, I will be your comrade. If you are old, I will be your son. I have a father who is 70, if he yet lives. I only love him and a young girl named Mercedes. My father has not yet forgotten me, I am sure.
Ooh. He's totally dead.
But God alone knows if she loves me still. I shall love you as I loves my father. It is well, returned the voice. Tomorrow.
These few words were uttered with an accent that left no doubt of his sincerity. Dantes rose, dispersed the fragments with the same precaution as before, and pushed his bed back against the wall. He then gave himself up to his happiness. He would no longer be alone. He was, perhaps, about to regain his liberty. At the worst, he would have a companion. And captivity that is shared is but half captivity. Plans made in common are almost prayers, and prayers where 2 or 3 are gathered together invoke the mercy of heaven. Okie-doke. All day, Dantes walked up and down his cell. He sat down occasionally on his bed, pressing his hand on his heart. At the slightest noise, he bounded towards the door. Once or twice the thought crossed his mind that he might be separated from this unknown, whom he loved already, and then his mind was made up. When the jailer moved his bed and stooped to examine the opening, he would kill him with his water jug. He would be condemned to die, but he was about to die of grief and despair when this miraculous noise recalled him to life. The jailer came in the evening. Dantes was on his bed. It seemed to him that thus he better guarded the unfinished opening. Doubtless there was a strange expression in his eyes, for the jailer said, "Come, are you going mad again?" Dantes did not answer. He feared that the emotion of his voice would betray him. The jailer went away, shaking his head. Night came. Dantes hoped that his neighbor would profit by the silence to address him, but he was mistaken. The next morning, however, just as he removed his bed from the wall, he heard 3 knocks. He threw himself on his knees. "Is it you?" said he. "I am here." "Is your jailer gone?" "Yes," said Dantes. "He will not return until the evening, so that we have 12 hours before us." "I can work then," said the voice. "Oh, yes, this instant. I entreat you." Close this out.
All right. In a moment, that part of the floor in which Dantes was resting his 2 hands as he knelt with his head in the opening suddenly gave way.
Woo.
He drew back smartly, while a mass of stones and earth disappeared in a hole that opened beneath the aperture he himself had formed. Then from the bottom of this passage, the depth of which it was impossible to measure, he saw appear first the head, then the shoulders, and lastly the body of a man who sprang lightly into his cell.
Woo!
Yeah.
That's very exciting. Okay, well,
now we're kicking.
Yeah, look at this. So he was able to dig through. I guess
That makes sense.
the cells were right next to each other, and I don't know why they couldn't have just yelled around. Maybe the jailer would have.
Well, he said the abbé said he dug like a 15-foot tunnel.
Okay,
So that's
they're
pretty
far.
far.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, he's pretty lucky that he'd already dug so far. This is all, pretty fortunate for Dantes. Real bad miscalculation on the part of the abbé, but it's working out here.
Mm-hmm. That's so nice.
What an exciting chapter! So
Yeah.
I'm happy for Dantes. Finally, some good news.
Some company.
Someone to talk
human.
to. Yeah,
Someone to
some
hug.
reprieve. This was a real roller
Someone to
coaster.
give him a back massage.
Someone to be like, "What do I look like? Is this beard doesn't look good on me? I can't tell. Describe to me my face. Draw me on the ground. This will have to do as a mirror." This was a real roller coaster of a chapter. We went pretty dark. He was close to dying. He was close to taking his own life.
Mm-hmm.
And then it just snatched from the jaws of death by the sound of that scratching in the wall, just by luck.
But if the abbé... Okay, so he only heard the scratching because the abbé was actually close.
I guess, yeah, the abbé had miscalculated and was digging towards his
that's
cell.
why he didn't hear him for 6 years?
I guess so, yeah. So there you go. There you have it.
So good.
Very interesting. That was a really, really great chapter. It was a lot of exposition. There wasn't much dialogue, at least at the beginning. It was more philosophical. But I guess that's what you get whenever it's just Dantes, unless he's talking to himself.
Yeah.
And the jailer who seems to be a bit of a dupe. I really enjoy how he got played. That scheme with the pan, the iron skillet or the iron pan with the soup.
Yeah, Dantes is
Brilliant.
hiding behind the bed, yes.
Yes! Victories, small victories.
Yeah. It was a long chapter.
It was a long chapter, but it was probably one of my favorites. I'm really happy for him.
Yeah, and I like the abbé. He's a character.
Yeah, he's just a little mad, but I'm into it.
Yeah.
He's a wild card. The next chapter is called A Learned Italian. I presume he's actually Italian.
Right, and remember we committed to the French.
But we're going to commit to the French. He's going to be Italian, but with a French accent. It's like in Star Wars, where all the Empire has British accents. Doesn't make any sense. Well, in this, everyone's going to have French accents. Everyone.
All French all the
Even
time.
the Italians. All French all the time. All right. Well, thanks for watching chapter 15 of The Count of Monte Cristo. I'm Mike.
I'm Em.
And that was a lot of fun. And we'll hopefully see you next week or next time we do this, which may be next week or might be a couple days. We don't know. So we'll see you then. Take care. Bye-bye.